talking about regulation. We have one of the most prominent panel discussions starting right now, the first one of the day. And we are going to be discussing the EU regulations on crypto assets. And we have some very nice prominent panelists that came from different parts of the world. The first person I'll introduce is the actual moderator of the panel. His name is Alexa Burmaz, all the way from Serbia, Belgrade. Welcome, welcome, Alexa. And he's the COO of Startup Societies. Now, the next guest panelist I'd like to invite over is Mr. Alexandros Konstantinou, which is the managing partner at MAPS Platis. Can we have a round of applause for Alexandros?
Thank you. Hello.
And the next guest we have is Mr. Dr. James Muscat Azopardi, a prominent big lawyer which is involved with regulations in all parts of the EU, coming all the way from Malta. Can we have a round of applause for James? And final but not least, we have Simon Zenios, which is the managing partner at Simon Zenios & Co. LLC.
Yes.
So the final panelist. In 30 seconds, we have a little delay. But yeah, it should be an interesting panel, guys. This is the first one of the day. And right after this, we go into the exciting part. The battles are going to start. So we're going to have the battle participants come in. That's going to be a very exciting thing right before lunch. So right after regulations panel, which to me and I'm sure you guys will also be interested to see what's happening at the moment, since there's a lot of change and a lot of different countries are implementing different laws and thought structures. It'd be great to see what we can learn today and what our great panelists can share. So there we go, Mr. Simon Zenios. I'll leave it to you guys. So Alexa, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Bogdan. So to all of us who know the history of Bitcoin, we all know that it was invented by pretty much cypherpunks and nerds and anarcho-capitalists of various stripes who were disheveled with the 2008 financial crisis and who wanted to design a monetary system that's safe from modern regulators. However, I do believe that the technology itself does underlie several steps that need to be taken by regulators, and naturally the legislators and governments of the world have been taking steps of various kinds, some good, some not so, in turning blockchain and cryptocurrencies into something that can be more generally used by large corporate firms and other economic actors. So I'd very much like to let Alexandros, Simon, start discussing about the nature of your regulation of blockchain in the EU. And my first question for the panel would be: is blockchain regulation the same everywhere in the European Union?
I wouldn't say it's the same at the moment. Not really. There is no European framework in respect to blockchain and crypto assets. We've seen individual member states issuing their own regulation, like Malta, which James, I'm sure, can expand much better on that. Others also, like Lithuania or Estonia, have also trying to issue their own regulation, and others are in the process, like France and the UK and others. One part only that there is regulatory convergence in respect to virtual currencies is a new money laundering directive, for example, that is coming up in January next year, where cryptocurrency exchanges and wallets will fall under the scope of the new money laundering directive. So anybody involved in exchange from fiat to crypto and vice versa will have to do KYC on their clients and also report, for example, suspicious transactions as well. So the answer is at the moment, there is no framework or an equal regulation on crypto assets across Europe, but I think with different reports and the vibes that are coming out from different authorities in the EU, I believe shortly there will be something coming up.
And may I ask the other panelists, which jurisdictions within the EU do you believe are leading the charge, so to speak? Would that be perhaps Malta and Cyprus?
I'm going to sound biased, but is this working? I said, hi. I'm going to sound biased, but factually, Malta, we've gone full steam ahead. And we do have a very comprehensive set of regulation. We've regulated tokens, we've regulated the technical side, we've regulated virtual financial assets. It's still early, it's still very early days. The answer to the previous question is clearly no. As you correctly point out, there's no European-wide framework. And it's interesting to see whether we will ever get to a European-wide, at least an EU-wide framework. However, having said that, we do need to keep in mind that there are certain vehicles that could be used within a blockchain context that are already EU-wide. So, for example, FMD, the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, that's EU-wide. You could technically set up investment funds that do invest in crypto assets and passport that across the EU. If we're speaking about STOs, you can still structure an STO using the Prospectus Directive, which will eventually be the Prospectus regulation. I'm speaking in theory. So in Malta, we've gone full steam ahead, and our regulator and our government obviously is totally committed to this field. What will be interesting is to see how other countries look at it and how they apply traditional legislation to a blockchain context.
And Simon, I'd like to ask you, what are the specific aspects of blockchain in business that you believe the European Union should pounce on, so to speak? Which would be the first fields that regulators should focus on within the blockchain to business space?
Currently, it's very difficult for the European Union jurisdictions to bring some new laws about cryptocurrencies. So, because of the KYC and AML is so strict, and for that reason, what ESMA is trying to do within the EU is to establish at least a regulatory framework for blockchain companies, trading platforms, because they don't want to see the same thing happening in crypto, in blockchain companies that happen with Forex. What happened with Forex just now, what's happening is that they are leaving the regulations and they are going unregulated, because while going unregulated, things are much more easier. This is something that they're afraid that might happen within the blockchain industry. So for start, they try to make things more, little bit less complicated and start with blockchain companies. And for crypto, we'll see how it will go.
So Alexandros, would you say that Malta and Cyprus are the primary jurisdictions for crypto, and is Europe the place that's going to be the blockchain capital of the world? Or do you believe that other jurisdictions in the world, such as Southeast Asia or maybe somewhere in the Americas, is going to outcompete the European Union in terms of the quality of regulation that they offer?
Malta, for sure, is innovative in this space and has also drafted special and bespoke regulations for crypto assets and DLT in general. Cyprus is still behind that, but it's going there. The government has formed a panel of different experts that meets up and tries to discuss ways to innovate through the DLT and also introduce regulations in respect of crypto assets. So I believe at some point Cyprus will be there and will issue something bespoke in these terms. We have to also understand that some part of the crypto space actually falls under the current regulatory regime in Europe. Like James said, if, for example, you are issuing a security token, most likely this will be considered a financial instrument under MiFID. So therefore, you have to apply all the relevant regulations, like MiFID Prospectus Directive, as James said, and so forth. In respect to exchange tokens or payment tokens, The EBA, the European Banking Authority, has said that those, in most cases, those do not fall under the PSD and EMI directive at the moment, although there are some cases that they might fall under the EMI directive. So it can be that certain crypto assets are currently regulated in the EU. And the discussion now, I think, will focus also on the crypto assets that do not fall under the current regulation, like utility tokens, which are not considered in the majority of cases as financial instruments. So in that scenario, regulators express concerns about investor protection because there is high risk associated in this kind of assets. So the discussion now falls whether to create bespoke regulation in terms of crypto assets that do not fall under the current framework, and also whether the current framework with respect to crypto assets that applies the regulation can be adapted and changed a bit to be more in line with the crypto space, because the current regulations, although they apply, there is the use of them and the application of them is a bit difficult into the crypto space. Now, as regards to whether Europe can become a center for blockchain, I believe Europe has struggled a bit to compete with other more leading jurisdictions like Japan, South Korea, Switzerland in terms of the blockchain space. But for sure, Europe doesn't want to fall behind. We have seen numerous reports last year and also this year from various authorities. We've seen that in the 2018 FinTech plan of the European Commission, blockchain has a prominent space there, and they recognize the importance and want to invest. We've seen different organizations formed by the European Commission, like the blockchain partnership that was signed by almost all EU member states, which the idea is to introduce blockchain technology into the governmental authorities and the public sector in general. We've seen EBA, ESMA, the FCA, and other regulatory bodies across Europe issuing reports and studying the development of this. So I think Europe has the potential, although it has to invest more. If we look at the example of the crowdfunding platforms, we'll see that Europe has fallen behind a lot compared to other jurisdictions like in America and in Asia. And only now Europe is catching up through a proposed regulation for crowdfunding. So if we follow that example, Europe must need to take more bold and fast actions not to lose the train.
I see. And Alexandros, could you just repeat one more time for the audience, what is the name of the plan or resource that's the primary source for all of this knowledge about the regulatory plans of the EU?
So
the FinTech plan, right?
What is them?
Is it the FinTech plan?
Yeah, the FinTech plan is just the European Commission issued in March last year a plan about FinTech, which involves different things inside regarding financial innovation. And one of the issues that are discussed and that there is going to be investment in this space and development is the blockchain.
I see. And James, a quick question regarding that. Are there any other resources that have come in recent months from the European Union or other similar bodies that govern and set out plans regarding the governing of blockchain to that extent as the FinTech plan?
Nothing concrete. So you will see vague statements saying we need to regulate, we need to look at anti-money laundering concerns. But nothing concrete. And we do need to move pretty fast as the EU. I agree totally. This is it's a jurisdictional issue, and we're not speaking about Malta, Cyprus, it's an EU issue, really speaking. We're competing for what is going to be a huge industry, and an industry that is very, very, very mobile. So we're I want to state the obvious here, but we're at very, very early days. We're going to get, in a few years, we're going to get to your Facebooks, your Amazons, your Googles. And we're speaking about young typically very, very, very mobile individuals who can set up a company anywhere. We see this all the time. People come, fly over, you meet them at conferences. They're, wherever you're looking at, Malta, Tel Aviv, Barcelona here, States, Asia. Where shall I set up? And doesn't make a difference to them. Because you've got 2 or 3 individuals, they're 25 to 30 years old, they've got some seed money, and they can move and set up anywhere. And if Singapore makes more sense than Malta, then they're going to Singapore. So we need to create a brand. Regulation is a brand. And so I think we tend to underestimate how much regulation is actually a brand that's attractive. If we look at, let me give you 2 examples in Europe. Look at retail funds with UCITS. UCITS became a brand. So you get its regulation, for those of you not into investment funds, UCITS is a regulation that is used to sell retail funds, and it sets a very high standard. So once your fund adheres to usage requirements, an investor feels more comfortable. So that's why I'm calling it a brand. Now, UCITS are sold in Chile, in Argentina, in Singapore, in Hong Kong. They don't need to comply, but they comply anyway because it's a brand. With online gaming, we've gone the other way around. The EU is a total nightmare. Every country is creating its own systems. You have to comply with increasingly complex regulation. There's no passporting. Countries are jealous of their own national lotteries, and it's a nightmare. And the EU is, although I say it myself, not that attractive any longer. So I think with blockchain, we need to work together.
Certainly. And Simon, regarding the vagueness that James had mentioned in his segment now, it's become quite clear that many regulators, especially in the EU, are particularly vague about the kind of steps that they're going to be undertaking regarding blockchain. So could you help us understand some of the more concrete steps that some of the more successful jurisdictions have undertaken thus far in the regulating of blockchain?
Very good question. I wouldn't say that any of the European Union members is successful, like an actual successful, because it's very difficult to be successful. On the one hand, we have the EU having very strict regulations on AMLs and KYCs, and I think that's part of your job, the compliance. And so when the regulators in one jurisdiction, they are proposing the regulations, the legislation, it has to be in accordance with the EU, and the banks then, they are very strict. So when the time comes for an ICO, STO, or a blockchain company to launch, and they want to cash out to start their project, it's very difficult because the banks are reluctant to accept this. So for this reason, they are going to an irregular jurisdiction to find a way to continue their project. So I will say that yet we haven't seen any successful jurisdiction, but I think Malta is going in a good way if they can do some small changes. And I think Malta can be a good scenario for all of us.
So I'd like to harken back to Alexandros, and another question that often crops up in the blockchain space is the interoperability between the concept of code as law and the actual regulations that legislators will be bringing about. Because in most ICOs in which fraud has happened, many of the founders of ICOs, initial coin offerings, have said that that is a part of the code, and as such it is legal by definition. So the question that I'm trying to ask here is, the future of regulation, will it be primarily more based on the code that the blockchains will be running on, or the expert opinion of legislators and regulators?
I'm not sure whether they will regulate the technology itself. I mean, this is, and we haven't seen it until now, I mean, in other practices. I don't know in the gambling space whether they regulate the code for the random generation of numbers in the machines. But in terms of other, if we see the financial regulation, it doesn't regulate the technology itself. It regulates the product, the result. Okay? So if the result is something that the regulators deem acceptable, or will set a framework that how this will be deemed acceptable, I think that will be the primary focus.
So, in other words, the regulators will not be regulating what the technology does itself, but rather how it operates in accordance with businesses and people in the economy.
Yes, how it reacts with investors, users of the technology, what information you can give out, how you can present it, how you can market itself. When you are having an ICO, for example, what information you need to issue to the public. If you do the transactions, what information needs to be to accommodate the transactions, who does the transactions, the transparency of the market, the safetiness of the market, and ensure all that the manipulation, for example, that is taking place now in the crypto exchange spaces. We see that there's been reports that there's market manipulation taking place, so they want to control that. But the code itself, I don't believe that they will go into that deep level to regulate the code itself.
I see.
In our case, it's different. Malta regulates the code. Malta regulates the entire technological arrangement. The way it works is that there are government-appointed system auditors, software auditors, and as part of the application, you submit your code to the auditors. And the auditor's label of, call it conformity, is a necessary part of, so we regulate both sides. You're actually looking at different regulators. So you've got the Financial Services Authority on one side and a specially set up authority for the technological side. It does make it more complex, but at the same time, it gives you a certain level of certainty. You mentioned the RNG, random number generator in gaming. It's more or less the same, but much more complex, because with the RNG, you're just looking at a very small part of a gaming platform. Here, you're looking at the entire platform. The difficulty for us lawyers is that we've got no idea of how the code works, typically. So the same thing in smart contracts. So I can draw up a contract. You can possibly have technological knowledge to change that into a smart contract, but I've got no way of knowing if what you're coding reflects my understanding of the understanding between the parties, but it's possibly a different discussion.
So another question I'd like to pose is, what are the primary threats that come from the blockchain to business pipeline that regulators have not been acting on? Do you believe that there is a field in the blockchain space that is under-regulated currently?
I didn't get exactly the question. Can you please repeat?
Oh, yes. So do you think that there is a part of the blockchain space currently that is under-regulated? So that's not regulated enough, and in which fraud and other unseemly actions are happening more often than they should?
Yes. As both colleagues mentioned, currently the regulatory framework we have under ESMA is for securities. We have nothing yet for utilities. So if it's utility, the token, then the regulators will say, okay, we are not touching it, proceed. Unlikely with SEC, with the USA, that said that there is no utility tokens for them. Doesn't matter who signs the opinion letter, if it's the biggest law firm in the world, for them, if there is a company behind that ICO, then automatically it's a security. So I think this is something we are looking forward to see in the European Union. Some regulation about utility tokens.
I'd like to add something here, because this is a really important point. When we're speaking about security tokens and defining security tokens, we need to keep in mind that our definition, we don't have a single definition globally. The EU looks at security tokens one way, looks at a security one way, and the US looks at security in a very different way. And this is confusing. So when you're reading about security tokens, unless you really keep in mind whether you're reading about the US or the EU, you're going to get totally confused. The US looks at the actual nature of the security. So is it similar to a share? Looks at, does it give a profit? The typical, if it looks like a, the Howey test, if it looks like a share, then it's a share. The EU, we take a very different approach. We look at transferability. So under MiFID, under European regulation, a share is a transferable security, and the key word here is transferability rather than the other elements. So if I issue a share and do not allow you to transfer it, then that's never a security token. So it's a very different approach.
Okay, let me add on that. There has been a survey of national competent authorities done by ESMA last year, and they gave them a few examples of tokens that were issued. And they asked them whether they consider those tokens whether they fall under the current legislation of MiFID financial instrument and specifically the transferable security, as you said. I believe the result was that a security token is a token, yes, that is characterized by transferability, but if it's linked to profit sharing or ownership or some kind of monetary benefit in relation to that, this is how the regulator will come to a conclusion that this is a MiFID financial instrument under transferable securities.
Correct, but plus transferability.
Yes.
So you always have to look at transferability, whereas in the US, it's irrelevant. That's the main difference.
Mm-hmm. But inherently, most tokens are transferable between each other.
It depends on the permission that you give to the token.
Yes, sure.
So we've had clients that have issued tokens and not allowed through the smart contract, not allowed those tokens to be transferable.
Not even under any conditions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, this makes it obviously less attractive to investors, because if my token isn't liquid, isn't transferable, then it creates different issues, but it's technically possible.
The next question that I'd like to put to the panel is the nature of the regulatory process in the European Union. Is the European Union going to attempt to create regulation that's, I hate to use this expression, but an inch deep and a mile wide, or are they actually going to attempt to localize their regulatory experiments in small zones before trying to expand successful regulations in such zones throughout the European Union?
What I believe in short is that the European Union is not going to become to be the leading instrument. It's waiting from the United States to decide what they want to do, because we haven't reached yet the actual decision from the US. So I think we'll firstly have to wait from the United States, and then the European Union will either follow or not follow.
It's very difficult to predict because we don't have any platform yet. So I would assume that at an EU level, regulators will wait to see how most European countries regulate and then try and find some conformity. The big question with regulation is, do you keep it technologically neutral? And that's really difficult. We do have to, because we're in a space where regulators cannot keep up with technological advances, but keeping it technologically neutral and still relevant is a big, big challenge, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah, I agree with, for sure, James. Actually, there is a mixed view at the moment. The regulators themselves and the authorities in the EU, they are confused, and I'm not sure they have an idea how to really regulate this space. I think they are waiting to see how the market develops. They are consulting between each other. Different member states have different views. Some of them, like Malta, is issuing their own regulation. ESMA expressed concerns about that because there will not be convergence across the EU and a level playing field. We need to see and wait and see what eventually will happen. Yeah. But at the moment, there is no really a clear view on how things will develop in terms of EU regulation, EU-wide regulation in this space.
The next question, and essentially final question that I have that personally interests me, is what does the panel think about the legal recognition of distributed autonomous organizations? Because these are going to be essentially digital bodies which have no humans inputting information or decisions into them at all. So can those be regulated in any way that is effective?
Let's start with this.
It's an extremely interesting development, because the whole question is, does a DAO have a legal personality or otherwise? I know that Malta, we're trying to arrive at possibly guidance on this, but we're still not there yet. The big question came from actually the case of the DAO, where money was lost, a considerable amount of money was lost, and who's responsible? We do need to find someone who's responsible for something like that, but I don't think there's an easy answer at this stage.
Yes, I agree. There is very little literature out there also about this, and there is legal uncertainty as well, whether at the moment such an organization can have a legal status. If I'm not mistaken, Malta, in the new regulations of Malta, you can have a platform with a legal or without legal personality.
But it's not clear yet. We don't have clear guidance yet.
So regulators and legislators need to sit down and see what's best to how and how to best to do this. And
I know that. I don't know. Is Steve Tendon here? I don't know. I can't see him. Steve Tendon, who? All right. Yeah, no, you were where? I can't. I'm sorry. I've got spotlights in my eyes. You're working on something of the sort at Max, no?
Yeah, I will talk about this later today.
That's your answer.
So I think.
I'm just seeing spotlights.
I think that now would be a good time for each of the panelists to give their own closing statements regarding the nature of blockchain regulation in the EU. So I'd love to start with Simon, actually.
Well, my conclusion is that we have to reach a unanimous decision all over the EU. We can't have European Union members have different legislations in each jurisdiction. We certainly have to attract all the companies within the EU, because if we see it also from the corporate perspective, from a business perspective, all businessmen, they are trying in any possible way to bring their money in the European Union. So we have to act quickly. We have to reach a unanimous decision and make a law unanimous to bring all the blockchain companies within the EU. That's my opinion.
I think I'll finish with probably what I see as the biggest challenge to the whole space, and that's the traditional banking system. We're seeing a situation, I'm speaking about Malta, we're speaking about a situation where it's extremely difficult to open a bank account for a company that in any way has anything blockchain related. I don't know what the situation is in Cyprus. I hope it's easier, but we do need to move forward in this regard.
And Alexandros, to close?
Yes, like every technological breakthrough can have both positive and negative applications, and for sure the blockchain and distributed ledger technology and its different applications like crypto assets have tremendous possibilities and benefits to the society. However, at the same time, there are risks, and some people misuse them. So there needs to be some sort of framework to regulate part of this market, but at the same time allowing the right amount of freedom to provide safety and transparency to the market so that it becomes acceptable from everybody.
I think that's a great bombshell to end this panel on. I want to thank all our panelists for their time and expertise. I think that this is one of the most important fields to speak about today as far as regulation goes, and I've heard it from many people at this event that blockchain is currently where the internet is, where the internet was in 1999. So that 10 years from now, everybody will be using it, and 20 years from now, everybody will wonder how we ever lived without it. So I want everybody to give a big hand to our panel. I want to thank Bogdan for organizing the event, and I'd love to move on to the next segment.